We're fortunate enough to have Dr. Bruce Greyson. He's the Chester Carlson Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the University of Virginia. He's consulted with the National Institutes of Health and addressed symposia on consciousness at the United Nations and at the Dalai Lama's Conference in India. He has earned awards in medical research and was elected the Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, the highest honor bestowed on that organization. He's the author of the recent book, After. The doctor explains what near-death experiences reveal about life and beyond. I think it's fair to say the book challenges our everyday ideas about our minds and our brains and offers key insights on how we can begin to live a more meaningful and fulfilling life. For anyone interested, I can attest to it. It's a fascinating book. So, Bruce, we've all heard the phrase near-death experience or NDE. What exactly is an NDE?
Well, thank you, Paul, for inviting me to be here today. I'm delighted to share this with you all. Near-death experiences are profound experiences that many people have when they come close to death, or sometimes when they're actually pronounced dead. And they include your thoughts being faster and clearer than ever before, while your brain is not functioning fully. They include very strong emotions, usually a sense of overwhelming peace and well-being, a sense of feeling unconditional love. They include what we often call paranormal experiences, just for lack of a better term. Things like a sense of leaving the physical body, sometimes seeing things from an out-of-body perspective, having a life review, seeing your entire life flash before you in a matter of seconds or portions of a second. And then things that are even more strange that may be like otherworldly events, like encountering some other entities that are often interpreted as being deceased loved ones for deities, and at some point coming to a border or point of no return, you know, you can't keep going and still come back to life. These happen to about 5% of the general population. That's 1 in every 20 people. So 2 or 3 people in this room probably have had a near-death experience. If you look at select populations, like people whose hearts have actually stopped, people who have cardiac arrest in the hospital, we find that between 10 and 20% of them have a near-death experience or are willing to talk about them. There may be more people who have them that aren't willing to share them with us.
Tell us about, how many years have you been doing this?
Well, almost 50 years.
Tell us about a couple of the more interesting NDEs you've experienced.
Yeah. It's hard to pick one or two since they're all incredibly fascinating to me. But one of the most interesting parts, especially for a psychiatrist, is the life review, in which people say their entire lives flash before them in a matter of seconds. And it's not like you're seeing a movie, it's often like you're reliving things in excruciating detail as well. And one of the more remarkable things about the near-death experience is that people often say they re-experience things in their lives, not only through their eyes, but from the perspective of other people as well who were involved in it. Let me give you an example of this. A fellow named Tom had a near-death experience when he was 32 years old. He was working under his truck in his driveway. He had the truck jacked up and he was underneath it. And an air pocket developed under the driveway, and it fell through. The truck crushed his chest. And in the few seconds that he had before he lost consciousness, he was aware of what was going on. He happened to be an Olympic athlete, so he knew how long he'd hold his breath. And he said that he left his body and he could hear his son on the phone calling the rescue squad. And he was with the rescue squad people in the vehicle as they're coming towards him, criticizing that he didn't even know how to use a jack properly. He said that when he had lost consciousness, he didn't really lose consciousness. He lost awareness of this world and went into this other realm where he had a whole host of things that I won't go into now, but I want to talk about his life review. And he remembered everything, and it was a detail. He remembers as a kid playing in his yard, being bothered by mosquitoes. And he said, in my life review, I could count how many mosquitoes there were. I couldn't do that back when I was a kid. But I remembered it in such detail, I could tell how many mosquitoes there were around me. He remembered one incident when he was a teenager, and he was driving his truck around town, young, impulsive, hot-rodding teenager, and he stopped at a red light, and an intoxicated man walked out in front of him as the light turned green. He started to go. And he jammed on the brakes, and he rolled down his window and started yelling to the guy outside the window. And the person, being quite drunk, reached his hand inside the window and slapped Tom across the face. Well, that's too much for a young, hot-headed teenager. So he got out of the truck and started beating the man up. And he hit him and hit him and hit him until he was just lying on the median. And then he calmly got back in his truck and drove away. In his life review, he said, he watched that from his own eyes, feeling his rage, his embarrassment of being slapped by this guy, and the adrenaline rush, and also felt it through the eyes of the drunk man. He felt every one of Tom's 32 blows on his face. Now, he couldn't have told you there were 32, except in the life review, he counted them. And he said he felt his nose getting bloodier and his teeth going through his lower lip. And he felt everything this man was feeling. And he came back from this experience when he woke up, realizing that we're all in this together. And I hear this again and again from near-death experiencers, that they come back feeling incredible compassion for other people because they realize, I'm the same as you. And this leads them to the golden rule, which is part of every religion we have. Do unto others as you have them do unto you. But for them, for the near-death experiencer, it's not a guideline you're supposed to follow. It's a law of the universe. That when you hurt other people, you hurt yourself. Another strange thing that often happens in near-death experiences is the sense of leaving the body and seeing things from outside. Now, often people report things that you might be able to guess were going on, like, I left this guy in the operation, I saw doctors in green scrubs. Well, of course. But very often we hear people say things that could not have been expected or predicted. I want to give you an example of this. Al was in his mid-50s when he had crushing chest pain, was rushed to the hospital, ended up having emergency quadruple bypass surgery. 4 vessels to his heart were clogged. He had to have them cleaned out and replaced immediately. In the middle of the operation, he tells me, he left his body, rose up above it, and looked down and saw his surgeon flapping his arms like he was trying to fly. And he demonstrated like this. When he told me this, I had trouble not laughing. I've been a doctor for 30 years. I'd never heard anything like this before. You don't see doctors on TV doing that. So I said to him, maybe that was a hallucination. You were under deep anesthesia. Maybe it didn't really happen. He said, no, I saw this. You asked my surgeon. So I did. And his surgeon, who was a very no-nonsense guy, said, well, yes, I did do that. He said, I've never seen any other doctor do this. But when I trained to be a surgeon in my native Japan, I developed this habit. I let my assistants start the procedure while I put on my sterile gloves and gown. And I walk into the operating room, and I watch them start the procedure. I don't want to risk touching anything that's not in the sterile field. So I put my hands where I know they won't touch anything, on my chest. And then I don't want to risk touching anything, so I point things out to them with my elbows. I don't know how we could have known this, but he did know. And he said, I saw him. I said, well, did you ask your doctor about it? He said, yes, I did. And what did he tell you? He said, he got very angry. He said, well, I must have done something right. You're here, aren't you? The third thing I want to mention is that many people in a near-death experience say that they see deceased loved ones. And this is often dismissed by skeptics by saying, well, of course, that's expectation, wishful thinking. You feel like you died. Of course, you want to see your dead grandmother, so you imagine that. But in a lot of cases, we have documentation with people who see or claim to see deceased relatives that no one knew yet had died, which kind of takes expectation off the table. Let me give you an example of this. This is a 25-year-old engineer who was actually in South Africa at the time, who was admitted to the hospital with severe pneumonia. And he had repeated respiratory arrests where he stopped breathing and had to be resuscitated. And he had one nurse who was about his age, a young woman, who was his primary nurse, worked with him every day. And one day she told him, I'm going to be taking a long weekend off. The other nurse is substituting for me. So he said goodbye to her, she went off. And while she was away, he had another respiratory arrest and had to be resuscitated. And at that time, he had a near-death experience. And he found himself in this beautiful pastoral scene. And there's some woods over there, and out of the woods comes walking his nurse, Anita. He said, Anita, what are you doing here? He said, Jack, I want you to go back. You can't stay here. I want you to find my parents. I want you to tell them that I love them very much. I'm sorry I wrecked the red MGB. This is back in the 1970s. And he says there were not a lot of MGs in South Africa back then. He woke up later in the hospital bed with a vivid memory of this experience. And he tried to tell the first nurse that came into his room. She got very upset and left the room immediately. It turned out that this young nurse had taken the weekend off to celebrate her 21st birthday. And her parents surprised her with a gift of red MGB. She got very excited and jumped in the car and took off for a test drive and crashed into a telephone pole and died a few hours before his near-death experience. There's no way he could have expected or known that she was going to die, or how she died, and if he did. So those are really important.
Are near-death experiences new to science, or have they been chronicled over many years in the past?
Well, they're not new to humans. I mean, we've been hearing these stories since we've had records. There are accounts in ancient Greek and Roman and Egyptian narratives about near-death experiences that sound just like the ones we have today. There are accounts from Aboriginal cultures all over the world, near-death experiences. Some French fur trappers back in the 1600s collected cases from the Chippewa Indians up in northern Michigan of near-death experiences. But science has been studying them. They have records in the medical literature going back to the 1800s, mostly in the French and German medical literature. But of course, they weren't called near-death experiences. They were called hallucinations or sensory deprivation experiences. In the 1890s, a French philosopher coined the term near-death experience, but it was in French. Experiences, I don't know what the term was, but anyway, it wasn't known in English until 1975, when Raymond Moody wrote a book called Life After Life, in which he described near-death experiences and gave us that name. And since then, there's been increasing interest among Western physicians and psychologists, and there's been increasing literature. And now there are some 200 papers published every year in the scientific literature about near-death experiences.
I'm going to read a little bit from a section of your book, and I guess my question is, how do you end up testing these and verifying these? What does that research involve? And I'm looking at, there's a chapter in Bruce's book, it's entitled Does Consciousness Continue? And the relevant portion is 2/3 of the experiencers said that we continue to exist in some identifiable form with our own thoughts, feelings, and personality traits, but that we continue to learn and grow spiritually after death. Almost half of the experiencers said that in the afterlife, we will still be able to watch loved ones who are still alive and may be able to communicate with and interact with them. I guess it's one thing to report it. How do you try to investigate it and verify it?
Right. Well, when they talk about things that happened in some other realm or dimension, we can't, of course, verify unless people they communicate with then tell them things about this life that we can verify. But when they talk about things that happen in this life, like when they see things going on around themselves, or sometimes at distant locations, we can verify those things. There have been some attempts to plant visual targets in hospital rooms where people were likely to have near-death events, such as intensive care units, cardiac care units, up near the ceiling facing upwards. So you can only see them if you're looking down from the ceiling. There have been 6 studies like this published so far, and they have never found anyone in these studies who claimed to have left their body and seen the target. So we don't have anything, evidence for or against the idea that this is true from these studies. When I talk to near-death experiencers about this type of research, they just laugh. They say, if you're out of your body for the first time, watching your body being resuscitated, are you going to look around the room for some irrelevant target you didn't know was there and try to remember it? There's no reason why they should do that. And yet we have lots of examples of people reporting things around them that were going on at the time they were accurate. One of my colleagues at the University of North Texas, Jan Holden, studied about 100 cases of people who claimed to leave their bodies and reported things that were potentially verifiable. And she found that 92% of them were completely accurate. 6% were mostly accurate but had some errors in them. Only 1% was wrong. So the vast majority of them were corroborated by third parties. So that's one way we can verify them.
Look at another section of your book. It's chapter 14 is entitled, What About God? And briefly, just a quotation briefly, more than 2/3 of the experiencers I've studied say that in their NDE they've encountered at least one person. 2/3 of those say they met a deceased person, an experience that offers at least potential for some verifiable information. But almost 90% of them say they encountered some kind of divine or godlike being. So can NDEs teach us anything about spirituality?
Well, they can certainly teach us a lot about spirituality. I don't think they can teach us much about God. Most people who have this experience, when we ask them to tell us about the near-death experience, they start by saying, well, there aren't any words for it. So we say, great, tell me about it. So we make them distort the experience by putting it into words. And they have to use whatever metaphors come most readily to them. And usually those come from religion or culture. So although people all over the world will say, I encountered this warm, loving being that was just radiating light and warmth, it made me feel unconditionally loved. Here in the US, people are likely to say it was God. People in India who are raised Hindu or Buddhist or other cultures like that will not use that word, but they'll describe the same thing. And we hear the same phenomenon being reported from ancient cultures as well. They report the loving being of light that makes them feel loved and warmth, which is obviously to them a deity, but they don't call it God like we do. And even here, many people who are raised in Christian or Jewish faith will tell us, I'm going to call it God, so you know what I'm talking about. But this wasn't the God I was talking about in church. It's much bigger than that. This is not just true of the deity, this is true of everything about the near-death experience. Many near-death experiencers say they went through some long, dark, enclosed structure to get from this world to this other realm. And most Americans, most people in Western cultures say, I went through a tunnel. But people in more remote areas that don't have tunnels won't use that. They'll say, I fell into a well, or I went into a cave. And I interviewed one fellow here who was a truck driver who said, I got something with this long tailpipe. So whatever metaphor comes to you is what they describe it as. So that's where we're left with the concept of God from the near-death experience, that we have something that certainly is experienced as a deity, but they don't really know what to call it. And most of them prefer not to give it a name. They just say that it's one thing, something that binds the world together. In fact, some people have told me near-death experience have told me that it's kind of like the Force in Star Wars. It sort of holds everything together, has a dark side and a light side, and it's all there.
In your book, you also have a chapter that's entitled "The Mind is Not the Brain."
Yeah.
And then you go into some description of your research which discusses whether consciousness can survive death.
Right.
Can you just explain that?
Okay, yeah. I was raised as a materialist in a scientific household, and I just sort of grew up knowing that the physical world is all there is. Well, you die, and that's the end. But I went through college and medical school with that mindset, and we were taught that the mind is what the brain does, that all our thoughts and feelings and perceptions are all created by the brain. And if that's true, then you can't have a near-death experience. Because when you're in a cardiac arrest or under deep anesthesia, your brain is not capable of forming these elaborate thoughts and perceptions and laying down memories. In everyday life, it seems as if the mind and the brain are the same. When you get intoxicated, you don't think very clearly. When you get hit on the head or have a stroke, that affects your thinking. But under extreme circumstances, like a near-death experience, that connection between mind and brain seems to separate. Now, there's another way of looking at this connection between mind and brain, other than saying that the brain creates the mind. Way back in ancient Greece, Hippocrates wrote 2,000 years ago that the brain is the interpreter of the mind. And there's been that thought ever since among philosophers usually, but lately among neuroscientists as well, that the brain somehow is an interpreter or a receiver. And some of them use the metaphor of a television set that receives signals, electromagnetic signals from outside, and translates them into an image and a sound that you can hear and appreciate. And it looks to you as if the TV set is creating the show. But of course it's not. It's coming from somewhere else. Now, if the show starts to go on a blink, if the TV set goes on a blink, you have trouble seeing it. That's what happens when we start intoxicating the brain and getting it hit, so that you don't see things very clearly. It's not surprising to think that the brain may be a filter for the mind, because we know that our bodies filter things out for us. We don't see all the light that's available. We only see a small amount of the visual wavelengths. We don't see infrared and ultraviolet because they're not important to us. And the brain evolved to help us survive in the physical world. So it rules out all those things that are not important to surviving in the physical world. It helps you understand things here so you can find food and shelter and a mate and avoid predators. Well, seeing deceased loved ones and seeing God don't help you with that. In fact, they may hurt you with that. So the brain normally filters out all that nonsense and just lets in the important stuff. And when the brain starts fading, when you start dying, that filtering system weakens so that other things can come through and you have access to all your full range of consciousness. And there are other phenomena besides near-death experience in which this happens, with something called terminal lucidity, in which people with end-stage Alzheimer's disease who haven't been able to recognize family or communicate for months or sometimes years suddenly become totally lucid again and recognize people and carry on coherent conversations, and then they die within a matter of minutes or hours. And we have no medical explanation for this, but it fits with the filter theory that the brain is there to perceive and filter and transmit these thoughts to us.
Maybe I should have started this question, Bill. What sparked your interest in this subject?
Well, as I said, I was not raised with any spiritual or religious tradition, and I didn't know that there was anything besides the physical world. When I was starting my psychiatric training, one of my first weeks I was asked to see a patient in the emergency room. And I went down to see her, and she was totally unconscious. I was trained she had probably overdosed, so I assumed that's what's going on. I tried to arouse her, I couldn't. But her roommate was waiting to see me room down the hall. So I went down to see the roommate, talked to her for about 15, 20 minutes about what was going on in the patient's life. Said goodbye to her and sent her on her way. Went back to see the patient again, and she was still unconscious. So we admitted her to the intensive care unit. When I saw her the next morning, she was still very groggy but arousable. I started to introduce myself, and she stopped me and said, "I know who you are. I remember you from last night." That kind of stunned me that I didn't know what she was talking about. So I said, I thought you were unconscious when I saw you last night. She said, "Not in my room. I saw you talking to Susan down the hall." That made no sense to me at all. The only thing that could happen is you left your body and followed me down the hall. But you are your body. How do you leave it? She saw that I was confused and then went on to tell me about the conversation I had with the roommate. What we wore, what the room looked like, what I said, what I asked, what the roommate said, and just totally stunned me. Well, I didn't have time to deal with my confusion. I was going to deal with hers, so I just shoved it in the back of my mind and dealt with her. I didn't tell anybody about this. They're going to think I'm crazy too. Well, somebody's playing a trick on me here. This can't really happen. And over the next few years, I heard other stories from my patients about almost dying and having these unusual experiences. And I said, well, they're psychiatric patients. Who knows what really happened? And then, as I said, in 1975, Raymond Woody published this book that talked about near-death experiences and described them as if they were perfectly normal things that happen to people. And I realized this isn't just psychiatric patients, it's everybody. As a scientist, I thought, I need to study this. If you're really a scientist, you don't run away from things that you don't understand. You run towards them and try to make sense of them. So I started collecting cases and trying to find consistent patterns, and then trying to learn more about see, can I understand what's going on here? And now after 50 years, I'm just trying to understand what's going on here.
What do you say, Bruce? I mean, you're a scientist, you're scientifically trained. And after reading your book and listening to some of your podcasts, it seems clear that we're nowhere near a scientific explanation for this stuff. So what do you say to people who say to you, this is really fascinating, but I'm a skeptic?
Well, I appreciate that because I'm a skeptic too. I think that's important for science. You don't accept anything without looking into it. There are people who call themselves skeptics, but they're really debunkers. They don't believe anything about this. They think they're firm believers in materialist philosophy. That's not a skeptic, that's a believer. A skeptic will say, I don't understand it, let me look further into it. And I think that's good. I think what we get is that's how science makes progress. Now, people often look at these and say, these are just anecdotes. They're not really science. Well, that's nonsense because the basis of all science is anecdotes. That's how you start doing things. You make observations that are surprising. And you start to analyze them, collect more, and design experiments to test them. But without the anecdotes, there's no science. So I think it's important to remember that science never gets to the truth. Science is like a metaphor for what's really going on. And what we get are better and better models for what's going on that are better than the ones we had last year, but they're not the truth. They're again a model. And we know that just as we laugh at what they thought 100 years ago, 100 years from now, they're going to laugh at what we thought. So we know that as one scientist said it, science is about getting better and better ways of being wrong.
Let me ask you one more question, then we'll open the floor to questions. It seems like we're bumping up against the limits of hypnobird knowledge. To what extent are you optimistic, or do you believe that at some point, probably not in our lifetime, there's going to be a scientific explanation for these events?
If by scientific you mean a materialistic explanation, I don't think we will find one. I could be wrong. And I continue to look for the one, and we keep testing different hypotheses, and we keep finding that they're wrong. But there may be still more out there that we haven't tested yet, that we haven't had technology yet to test. But I suspect from all this work that what we're going to find is that science doesn't have, at least now, the vocabulary at least to talk about things, let alone find an answer for them. When I started this work, I was convinced science was going to be the way we understand everything. I still think it's the best way to understand what's going on in this physical world. I'm convinced now that there are things that we can't get to with our science, but it's not the only way to understand things. There are other ways of knowing things from your own personal experience. You know, when you study art or literature, you know, these aren't scientific, but you can learn a lot from them about human nature, about who we are and what we're doing in the universe.
Thank you. We'll open the floor for questions, if anybody, Chuck.
That is a very complex issue, of course, and I'm sure there are many people around the world like yourself who are studying these issues. Have you developed some common protocol for studying these issues, researching them, and thinking your findings? Is there some scientific method that you use, which you and others have sort of devised to get to where you are with respect to all these cases?
Good question. Thank you, Chuck. Well, of course, we're stuck with what people tell us, which is not really what happened. It's what they understand, and then what they can verbalize of what they understand, and then what they choose to tell us what they can verbalize. So it's several steps away from the actual experience. But we've developed tools of refining what we're hearing. And back in the 1980s, I published a scale to quantify near-death experiences. So the researchers all around the world will be studying the same thing. And that's still being used now. It's been used in hundreds and hundreds of studies all over the world and translated into 20 languages. That's a standard for studying the experiences. But we're really stuck with looking at the experiences, trying to factor out what's going on into the scale. We can look at what factors in the personality or the physiology at the time were correlated with different parts of the experience, and what different parts of the experience are associated with what after effects there are. And the after effects actually is, I think, for a psychiatrist, the most important part of the experience. Consistently, you see people's lives change as a result of these experiences. And this is one way I know they're not hallucinations. You don't turn your life around because you hallucinated something. But your life after a near-death experience is never the same. People report that they're not afraid of dying anymore, not afraid of death anymore. No matter what the NDE was like, they're no longer afraid of death. And that paradoxically makes them not afraid of life anymore either. They're not afraid of taking risks and living life to the fullest. What's the worst that can happen? Die. People also report that much more spiritual than they were before the NDE. They don't necessarily mean more religious. They appreciate more the ritual and the song and the camaraderie of fellowship, but they're not tied to the dogma of any particular religion. They feel like they have a deep connection to the divine themselves and to the universe and to other people. And that makes them more compassionate. I have seen this actually also in people who were confirmed atheists before the NDE. And now they feel there's something greater than me that I'm a part of. And you see this change their behavior as well. People change their careers, people change their relationships because of the NDE. One fellow we knew I guess it was in his 30s when we saw him, but he had been a career Marine. He'd been a high school bully. He was a very macho guy. His life goal was to become a Marine, and he was a sergeant in Vietnam, and he was shot in the chest. And he had a near-death experience, which I won't probably go into now, but the result was that when he came back, he couldn't shoot anymore. The idea of hurting someone else was just intolerable. So he ended up leaving his chosen career and come back to the States, and he actually became a paramedic. But I've heard this again and again from career police officers. One of them became a teacher. People who were in competitive businesses who came back saying it no longer makes sense to get ahead at someone else's expense, and either change the way they do their work or they change careers entirely and go into a public profession like healthcare or teaching or social work or clergy.
Anybody else? Ron?
So, is it your belief that the scientific tools that are put through the constructs and the paradigms of the third dimension are at some point being able to pick up from an absolute other dimension?
That's my hope. I think this is too ambitious to say it's my belief. But you know, science has always been changing. Over the centuries, it gets better and better tools, better and better language. And I think that someday we may have the tools to understand this other realm. Because we don't know about the world. You know, some physicists tell us that 5% of the matter in the world is what we can see. That 95% is dark matter. You have no idea what that is. Is that somehow tied in with the spiritual realm? We have no idea yet. But someday we may have the ability to study these things.
Can you simulate an NDE with
Good question, Paul. People have tried to do this with hypnosis, with guided meditation, and in the last decade or so, there's been a lot of research with psychedelic drugs, trying to get people to simulate like a near-death experience in a psychedelic drug, with some success, but it's not quite the same thing. One near-death experience told me that under psilocybin, I saw heaven. My near-death experience, I was in heaven. So there's a difference there between seeing it and experiencing it. Another one told me it was like being in combat versus watching a war movie. You may use the same words to describe what you saw and smelled and heard, but nobody would say that these two things are the same thing. So you can mimic the experience, but you can't really reproduce it.
Can't replicate it. Any other questions? Amanda?
Yeah, I'm curious to know if you think that everyone who almost dies has these experiences, and if not, if there's anything that near-death experiencers do have in common before they have these experiences.
Yeah, it's a good question, Amanda. As I said, about 10 to 20% of people who have cardiac arrests will report to us a near-death experience. What about the rest of them? We don't know. We've tried to look at different personality traits associated with it, different physiological events. We can't find anything. There's nothing that differentiates people who have near-death experiences from those who don't, or what type of near-death experience they may have. Will everyone have them if they stay dead long enough? I have no idea. Maybe the ones who don't tell us either can't remember it, or haven't been dead long enough to experience it. You know, one of the theories that was often put forward was that lack of oxygen causes these near-death experiences. And there have been now 3 studies in different countries, in Belgium, in UK, and here, actually measured oxygen levels in people as they approach death. And what they find was that those who have near-death experiences actually have better oxygen supply than those who don't. So what that may mean is that if you don't have enough oxygen, then you can't remember it later on. So maybe that's part of the problem, that people who are at that level can't remember to tell you what's going on later on.
Beth, you had your hand up.
Well, question out of curiosity. Did any of these people ever report maybe that they wanted to say goodbye or say something to somebody who was living, like in that last moment of thinking, oh, I would say this was a lot of fun with a transgender?
Yeah.
It sounds like they have other different experiences, but even if they had any kind of communication they need to pray and speak to someone who's still alive.
Yeah. A lot of people in a near-death experience will see the deceased loved ones and hear communications from them. That's usually reassuring things, I'm okay, things are fine here. And they in turn may want to communicate to people back here about what's going on. And often they try but are unable to do that. I have some examples of people in a near-death experience who tried to communicate with a loved one back here, and then independently I talked to the loved one who said, I heard this feeling inside my head that sounded like it was from him. But those are unusual. Usually people will say, I tried to communicate with them, and I tried to tell the doctor, stop it, I'm okay. And he said, nobody hears me. I can't get through to them.
Any other questions? Another question I should have asked you. Bruce is part of the Division of Perceptual Studies at UVA, which isn't just about studying NDEs. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the work of DOPS.
Right, this was started about 54 years ago. Ian Stevenson, who was then the chairman of Psychiatry at UVA, and he was mostly interested in studying young children who remembered their past lives or claimed to do so. And over the decades, we have now collected cases from almost 2,500 of these young children, preschool children, who claim to remember past lives, and when we've been able to investigate them, we found that there is a past life that corresponds in many details to what the child says. There's no explanation for this. There are some details of the experience that don't fit a typical reincarnation scenario. So I'm not sure we have the good explanation for that, but it's something going on that we don't understand. The group also studies other phenomena that bring into question the mind-brain relationship. For example, out-of-body experiences that people can have under non-near-death situations. We've studied mediumship. We've studied people who do spontaneous healings, a variety of things that relate to this borderline between life and death, spontaneous communications from the other side, so to speak.
You know, you're trained as a scientist, and scientifically, apparently not able to verify many of these things. So has it been challenging for you?
Yes, it has. But as a scientist, you need to keep trying to do that. If you just ignore things that you don't understand, that's not science. So we just keep trying to find better ways of quantifying these phenomena and corroborating with third parties whenever we can.
Any other questions? Charlie?
Are any of the experiences very negative? Sounds like they're pretty.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. There are some. We really don't know how many because people are very unwilling to talk about the unpleasant experiences. But most people who study this feel like between 1% and 5% of all near-death experiences are unpleasant. And we tried to look at what causes people to have an unpleasant experience, and we really can't find that. It's not true that good people have nice experiences and bad people have unpleasant experiences, which isn't surprising. We've got accounts from Catholic saints throughout the centuries writing about the dark night of the soul. They were certainly good people. And I've had people contact me who were on death row, who had a heart attack and a near-death experience that was blissful. So you don't really know why some people have an unpleasant one or not. I can tell you that the after effects are pretty much the same. And people come in back, even if they have an unpleasant experience, no longer afraid of death. And I feel like they were sent back to do things better this time.
Thank you.
Can you give us an example of an unpleasant experience?
Yeah, most of the
For
unpleasant
him sitting
experiences,
here.
most of them they sound just like the pleasant ones, but they're experienced in a very frightening way. People report being ripped out of their bodies, thrust down a tunnel, and confronted with this blinding light, and they're terrified of it, and they're trying to fight against it. And most of these are people who are very much in control of their lives and are terrified by the idea of being out of control. And you don't know what the NDE is like, you're not controlling. So they're trying to fight it. And at some point, some of them get exhausted trying to fight, and they surrender to it. As soon as they do, it becomes blissful. So for those people, it's the resistance to it that makes it unpleasant. There are others who report being in a black, featureless void. Nothing to see, nothing to hear, just your consciousness and nothing else. And they feel, this is eternity, just me and nothing, which is terrifying to most Westerners. I've heard from people who were raised into saying, I had this experience, it was blissful, this is Nirvana. So it's the cultural interpretation of what it was like for you.
Any other questions? If not, Bruce, thank you very much. This has been enlightening and interesting. And again, if you have any interest in the subject, I would urge you to read the book, because what you heard today is just touching the surface. So thank you very much for being here, and we give you